Welcome to everyone, and as you probably are aware, this year we attempted or wanted to have a Student Services Centre conference in Wellington, New Zealand, and unfortunately we had COVID, so we couldn't travel anywhere, we couldn't do anything. So in this place we've actually had a series of programs which are sort of aimed at the student experience, and this one's come up from EAB, who do some powerful research in the area worldwide. We have Gary and John and Anushka joining us from EAB, and it's 9 o'clock in the evening over there, so have some pity on them. They've had a full day of work and they're still going. So that's fabulous. So look, enjoy the program, and I won't say any more because we haven't got much time. So I'll join you again at the end of the program. Over to you, Gary.
Sounds good. Thank you, Paul, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Gary Guadagnolo. I'm a director of research at EAB. Certainly want to thank Paul and the rest of the team at ATEM for the invitation to present for the panelists today that I'll introduce in a minute who volunteered their time. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm American. I am beaming into your homes and perhaps virtual offices from the heart of reason and camaraderie, Washington, D.C. Goal for the hour, as Paul mentioned, really is to focus on student experience and thinking about it from a couple perspectives. One, I want to share with you some of the research that Paul mentioned that we at EAB have done on this topic, particularly in the wake of a wholly unique disruptor to the sector. To give you some tools to help you and your teams think about some of these challenges, and third, to spark conversation about what has worked, what hasn't, particularly as we finish out one academic year and begin to think about the next one. On this slide, you can see another picture of me, my colleague Anushka Mehta, who will be hanging out in the chat bar. I certainly invite you to ask questions of us and each other. Introduce yourself if you would like. We'll be posting a number of links to various resources we mention during the time today as well. And also joined by three illustrious panelists as well, who will be sharing some of their expertise and perspectives across the time as well. Catherine Blythe from Australian Catholic University, Tony Reed from University of Sunshine Coast, and Liz Bishara from Auckland University of Technology. So certainly thank each of them for their time. Before we dive in, I wanted to give you a quick overview of EAB if you're not familiar with us. At its heart, EAB is a global research company specializing in education. We've been working for 13 years, partner with primary, secondary, tertiary institutions, really across all range of academic, business, enrollment, student affairs, student experience goals. We work with 1,900 different institutions in the US, Canada, UK, Ireland, EU, Australia, New Zealand, beyond. Really, our perspective is that the sector needs a kind of global sharing of ideas and information in order to thrive. And so that's really our model, is to hear what other institutions are doing well, to share that information out. And then we help both communicate that, publish resources, and the like. And so what Paul and the rest of the group at ATEM asked us to do is leverage that global perspective in our presentation to think about how student experience has been evolving. We've been working in that topic for well over a decade, and far more than I can cover in the next 50 minutes, but I will try to get through a lot of it. I know you're all Zoom pros now. A couple of words of advice. Certainly, please keep yourself on mute and your videos off. If you can, I would recommend the side-by-side view so you can see both our lovely faces and the slides. Of course, invite active participation in this presentation as well, both in the chat area where Anushka will be helping moderate, and also another feature I wanted to share with you. We'll be looking through, for your participation, through some live polling as well. We use a platform called Poll Everywhere. It might be new to you, but rest assured all of the results and the contributions are anonymous, not collecting any identifying information or anything like that. You can access the virtual polling station by going to the website on your screen, pollev.com/EAB500. I think Anushka is putting a link in the chat area as well. I encourage you to go ahead and click on that, open it up in your browser or on your phone. Each poll page in the presentation will give you some instructions on how to vote or submit an answer or feedback. So I thought I would give that a go as we get started here, just to acclimate you to this software and the opportunity for your feedback. I'm going to start off with a bit of a softball, but again, gives you a chance to get used to the platform, get you in the right frame of mind for the next hour or so. So the question here, you can see in a couple of words, why does student experience matter in the context of a global pandemic? So in a couple of words, just feel free to respond with whatever comes to mind, no matter how grandiose or mundane. And with any luck, some answers that you are currently thinking through will begin to magically appear on the screen if I've done everything right on the back end. So again, thinking through, why is it worth spending time on this topic of student experience? Great, I love that, it always matters. Maybe someone thought that was a bit of a trick question. Higher education is really all about the experience. I love all of these. I'll note that certainly we are going to share this presentation with people who attended and those who signed up and couldn't attend, and I will collate all of these responses onto the slides as well. Retention, connectedness, providing certainty to students. No surprise seeing retention. Students are feeling more isolated as a result of the pandemic. We'll be touching on some of the larger mental health issues later on. So, certainly a lot of the responses coming in are the ones we would expect to see, right? I think across the sector, we, particularly if you signed up for this webinar, agree on the power, the importance of student experience. I'm going to move us forward just in the interest of time. We'll have several more of those types of interactive polls, so feel free to keep that link available and easy access. So again, no real surprises to what we just saw. I think most, if not every institution does and should trumpet a meaningful student experience as a hallmark of its offer. This resonates well with the raison d'etre of our sector, right? A meaningful student experience is correlated with so many markers of success, both during and beyond a course of study, whether that's retention, workplace preparation, emotional well-being, and more. If you look at the literature on this topic, it's clear that the attention we've devoted here has not been in vain. And frankly, attending to the student experience can also boost the institutional brand as well. If you can see this in perhaps improved league table rankings, positive results of regulatory surveys, good word of mouth publicity, your institution really can craft a compelling message about value for money in the public square. Now, despite almost universal agreement on the importance of the student experience, we at EAB have constantly hear this widespread feeling among sector leaders that what has been working in the past isn't necessarily going to be good enough for the future. Part of the problem is inherent to common student experience assessments. They're oriented around what some might say is an antiquated view of student experience, overwhelmingly focused on teaching and learning and career outcomes. On the left of this slide, I've shown the distribution of questions across various student experience factors for a handful of national level surveys. So you can see this trend is playing out really across the globe. Some institutions take this even farther, falling into a game of whack-a-mole, chasing after improved performance in a never-ending deluge of questions on these surveys. That's captured in the quote on the right, one of our partner institutions in the UK saying, we're constantly scrambling to respond to dips in performance in one question of NSS or the other. Now, to be clear, learning and teaching and career outcomes are incredibly important. They're the backbone of why someone pursues further higher education. And so while we can't necessarily ease off in our efforts in that realm, students are nonetheless bringing to campus a much broader set of expectations that influence their experience, and that we in the sector have to be prepared to address. On this slide, I wanted to briefly touch on some of those broader sets of expectations that are driving this ever-expanding remit of our student experience teams. Please chime in the chat bar if you think there are others that you would want to add to this list. But this was mentioned a minute ago by someone in responding to that survey question. an expanded mental health and physical safety infrastructure. You know, to say, okay, I struggle with anxiety. What kind of support are you going to offer me if I accept a position in the course at your institution? Frictionless Amazon-like consumer experiences, right? This frustration, it shouldn't be so difficult for me to register for next term's modules if I'm able to pick up my phone and with a few taps, you know, order some food to be delivered to my door, or whatever the other technologies are that making the rest of life so easy. Why is it so hard in a university experience? A curated, personalized pathway. I want to feel like I'm more than just another applicant or a reason the university is able to hit its bottom line. And intentional physical and social environments. Of course, that looks very different this year, but otherwise, you know, what are the meaningful interactions I can have on campus? I'm spending a lot of money to come here. What are you able to offer me? Now, given students increasingly expansive expectations of their experience, in part driven by the issues I just mentioned, institutions need a new framework for organizing and analyzing their efforts. From EAB's long time working on this topic, too often we see efforts to improve student experience taking place in organizational silos. From our perspective, improving total student experience requires a holistic approach. So we've articulated 6 critical aspects of student experience that institutions have to take into account. So you can see them around the circle on this. So enrollment, how do we begin creating that student experience from the first time they land on your website or ask a question about what a particular course of study might look like? Of course, the academic experience, everything that's going on inside of the classroom to lead to positive learning outcomes. The administrative experience, it's one we don't always think about, but all of the institutional processes, the physical and digital estates, everything that's supporting and providing the structure around what's going on in and outside the classroom. Well-being, of course, an emerging trend. Social, thinking through all of the interpersonal interactions that are going on. And then, of course, career, certainly the skills, the employer partnerships, placements, internships, everything that is going to be setting a student up for the workplace. Now, again, this model isn't meant to dilute or diminish the importance of teaching and learning or career preparation, but instead to contextualize those activities alongside all of the other aspects that influence the total student experience. And underlying all of those are some of the foundational principles that have to cut across each of these areas. So equity and inclusion, how do we make sure our institutions are places that support access and pathways for success? Digital transformation, coordinated student support, how do we make sure that the improvements aren't just taking place in silos or in a vacuum? Now, from our perspective, this model still works on both sides of the COVID crisis. We would still think that the same things about student experience matter. We're just now in a time where we're thinking about them in new ways, how we communicate and deliver these experiences. How this plays out is going to look different, but even if you were designing the student experience from scratch, you'd probably still end up with these core areas that you would have to tackle. Now, I mentioned a minute ago, one of the underlying principles of our total student experience model is around coordinated student support. Improving that has to begin with an honest assessment of your current performance. And as I mentioned earlier, we at EAB have been looking at this issue around student experience, student success for well over a decade, leading to a lot of both research, experience, insight on this topic. And we took all of that together and we created this tool to diagnose your approach to the total student experience. Now, don't worry, not expecting you to read everything on this slide. Anushka will be sharing a link to this resource in the chat area, and you can also click on the link when we send this deck around later. But what we've done here is we've taken those 6 elements I mentioned on the previous slide and thought about some of the most impactful things that you can do as an institution in each area. So in the enrollment experience, thinking about what does personalized multi-channel communications look like? And not just have we said this is important, but all of these areas are supported by EAB's best practices library. So I encourage you to download a copy. Again, Anushka will share a link. Use it as you see fit. As you're looking through this, if there's a specific area or two where your institution either is or needs to be focusing, be happy to share some of those resources with you. Just let me know. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that I think this model of student experience still holds up on either side of the coronavirus crisis. That doesn't mean its application remains unchanged, though, or that new challenges haven't emerged or become more acute. So in this slide, I wanted to mention a couple of the ways we're tracking the evolution, and then I'll invite our panelists to briefly offer their response for how they're seeing this play out on their campuses, and perhaps what else should be included on this slide. So moving down this slide, first beginning with the student services ecosystem, I think we've been seeing the expansion of student services to meet new and different needs. We're getting better about collecting data, knowing student behaviors, what are the right inflection points. But the impact of COVID-19 has been that these in-person services have no longer been a given. Digital divide has certainly exacerbated some of these issues too. New and different conversations around value for money. I think we've been paying more attention to how students out of classroom experiences contribute to their total student experience, more attention to what the right postgraduate career outcomes are. But given the larger kind of global economic situation, there are going to be ongoing and more ROI concerns. Is this a good use of my time and resources? And evolving student demographics, a growing diversity of students who have been matriculating into further and higher education. But there are also, that comes with that expanding population, more and complicated and different approaches to isolation, anxiety, stress. As we begin to serve more underserved students, what do we do to ensure their enrollment or re-enrollment? So we'll spend the rest of our time in this webinar thinking through these, but I want to now invite Liz, Catherine, and Tony, if he was able to join us, to turn on their video and audio, and would love to hear from you. Which of these trends have you felt most acutely at your institution this year? What would you add or expand upon? And as you're doing that, I have two more poll everywhere questions that I'm going to pull up, and but otherwise, Catherine, I see your video is on, so I might give you first right of refusal, as it were.
Hi, thanks, Gary. Yeah, we've seen those trends as well. One of the observations that we certainly noticed is the value for money question, and particularly when we moved many of our face-to-face activities onto online, and we already had quite a few activities online, but it opened up a real debate about whether students should be paying for the same thing online, and if there's different costs, different value. So that was an interesting discussion to start embarking on. The other thing that we, of course, were really conscious of, we actually at ACU kept our campuses open all the way through, because we were concerned about our students who didn't have access to internet or computers, or just didn't have a suitable space at home to study. So we left our libraries open so that students could come on campus if they wanted to. Now, we didn't have many students, but we did have some come, and I think that was really important.
Great, thank you. Liz, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for that. Here at AUT, one of the things I noticed was a common theme around how we delivered additional support to students through this year has been really that elimination of equity assessment. And so it's been around a high trust approach in the offering of services. So that's financial assistance, digital accessibility, and the provision of data or devices. And historically, we may have done a much more significant assessment and ultimately presented more barriers to that provision and accessibility of provision. However, this year, moving away from that, and really a student just needed to tell us that they needed support, and that was the only interaction kind of required for us to then be able to use all of the resources that we had available to support the student with what they needed. And that was extremely successful, I think, around breaking down those barriers of requesting help, accessing providing support and meeting the not just the vulnerable students, but the students that had short-term issues, just as much as students with more significant problems.
Great, thank you very much. I saw Tony joined us a minute ago. I'll give him a break for now, and we'll return to him a little bit later on, just to not give him a sneak attack. I want to just review quickly the results of these two slides. The first one, the aspect of student experience that has been most affected by the pandemic, academic, probably no surprise there given the transition to virtual online education in many cases. But well-being, right? I'm not surprised at all that that has by far and away the highest area, certainly reflective of what Catherine and Liz just said. And this as well, where have you been spending a lot of time and resources as a result of the pandemic? Academic, well-being, again, I don't think that would be too surprising to anyone. But Catherine and Liz, thank you for those comments. We'll be returning to you in a few minutes as well. I'm going to keep us going along just in interest of time. For the remainder of our time here, I'll be focusing on 3 opportunities or domains for improvement in student experience. And so I'll give some high-level commentary on each before asking our panelists to chime in. The first of these is in the virtual delivery of support services. The part of this session was around the kind of virtual shift here and how we're thinking about nudging students towards the services, opportunities, information that they need, and doing so in the right time and in the right way. One of the ways that this has become more challenging this year is that the traditional communication pathways, points of interaction that we did this in the past have no longer been available. But there's also some aspirations that I note on this slide. But maybe the disruption of this pandemic will offer new opportunities to rethink how we operate in this domain, perhaps by articulating this right balance between what we do as a high touch interaction, what we do in a more automated approach. How can we create a more equitable environment by removing some of the unwritten rules that students are often encountering, and thinking about a more inclusive support for all learners, not just the ones that we think of as our traditional undergraduates. So I'm going to run through a couple ideas here. I mentioned that last slide, this idea of nudging, a definition at the top of this slide, if we're on the same page here. Any small feature of an environment that attracts people's attention and alters their behavior, but does so in a way that doesn't compel. Progressive institutions use nudges in a variety of ways, often promoting resilience when students are faced with the demanding realities of student life and pushing them towards resources, behaviors that we know are associated with success. We've seen nudges to be particularly powerful this year as students are struggling to balance not just their studies and work and family obligations, but all of the emotional stressors they've had to deal with. Call out on the left of this slide a number of the forms that nudges take. Quick polls that can lead students to think through, how am I doing mentally, or will it remind them and push them towards available resources? When well designed, nudges can prompt proactive engagement with university services that ultimately support their success and attainment. And this year, many institutions have been telling us that this has really been an essential tool in their toolbox, given so much the need to break through so much of the noise that students are encountering. I wanted to share one example with you about how this has played out at Concordia College. It's an institution here in the US and in Minnesota. Back in March, when they suspended operations and instructions, their emergency response team was worried that some students wouldn't have the necessary resources or support to access online modules and to finish the term. So they created this survey of students to learn what each student planned to do in terms of their housing, what their financial situation was like, what their access to technology that they had. Most students completed the form, but not all. And in looking at the makeup of those who didn't complete the form, some of the leaders there suspected that these were the students most in need of support. So they initiated this text messaging campaign to nudge students towards completing the online form. And they eventually were able to get to 99% of students filling this out. And it was really a critical step because they were able to give most of those students who had not yet completed that form some of the emergency financial aid that they had set aside for students most in need. Concordia was also able to create a more holistic picture of immediate and longer-term student needs with what they called student progress reports. So academic staff who were quickly becoming the primary, if not only, point of connection between the student and the university could flag students that they deemed at risk, whether that was emotionally, financially, technologically. And then the Student Development and Campus Life Division at Concordia could redeploy their available staff to quickly act on some of this time-sensitive information around student needs, ensuring that those who needed it received quick help. Another area where we've seen an evolution of this services this year is in the virtual delivery of advising. So the broad range of academic, financial, administrative, personal support that I think we all agree is very effective at retaining, graduating, supporting students. Before this year, in many cases, virtual advising was primarily a supplemental offering or was reserved for online learners and working adults who might not be able to meet in person between 9 and 5. It was a niche strategy at many institutions, but the pandemic has changed all of this, and virtual advising has played a critical role in supporting students. And this trend, I think, is only going to be continuing. Both data and anecdotal evidence suggests that there's been a positive impact on how students are engaging with support. We've seen from data both at EAB through our own student success platform and larger data sets that students are making more appointments and they're actually showing up to the appointments that they make. The virtual appointments tend to be shorter and more efficient. And that's in part in combination with nudges. On the right, you'll see it on our EAB student success platform, a 25% increase in the number of appointment requests that have been accepted when they're pushed directly to students' phones. I think there's a couple other important reasons why it makes sense to continue this virtual advising even after in-person meetings become possible again. Students have busy lives, complex lives that makes it difficult sometimes to carve out that time for an in-person meeting. And as a result, this means that not every student has equal access. And it may be that students who need the most support are least able to engage. So these shorter on-demand meetings via phone or laptop tend to be even a more equitable approach for students trying to seek out support while also balancing school, family, and work. And I think there's also something to be said that virtual advising can be a selling point for your institution. Even before the pandemic, more students were expecting these virtual interactions, virtual support in other aspects of their lives as well. And now students may be nervous about the possibility of in-person interactions. Moving forward, they may begin to show a preference towards those that offer this virtual as a safe, convenient support. The next and final example I wanted to share here was around the delivery of support services with employer engagement. No surprise that employers and students alike have expected career services leaders to offer more high quality virtual experiences in the wake of the pandemic. And we've seen campus career services redesigning virtual events, creating new and kind experiences for employer-student interactions. The virtual environment creates new opportunities, but also new challenges for removing barriers to access. Perhaps most important is the role of preparing both students and employers for this new world that we're entering in. One of the leaders and most innovative examples I've seen is from Northeastern University. I'd encourage you to check out what they call their experiential network. Northeastern developed this program in conjunction with some of their biggest employer partners. And the idea is that students engage in short virtual projects. They spend around 30 to 40 hours of work over 6 weeks. All of the work is completed remotely via Skype, email, or phone. And the work isn't just busy work. These are meaningful projects centered around significant business decisions or organizational needs. No surprise that it's been particularly popular this year as students both to look to make sure that they're having experiences that are going to make them attractive as potential hires, and in terms of acclimating to potentially a new normal of remote work. We've captured a number of these examples and recommendations in our virtual employer engagement playbook. Nishka will share a link that feel free to check those out for more examples. But with that, I wanted to turn it back over to Liz, and I'd asked her to comment on how the virtual delivery of services is playing out in her role at Auckland University of Technology. So Liz, over to you. Meanwhile, I'm going to put up another poll question for the group.
Great, thank you. One of the things I wanted to touch on is one of the initiatives we delivered was a transition program, and it was really about returning to study in an online format. We were quite fortunate with the first lockdown in Auckland that we actually went into a semester break period, and it coincided with our Easter holiday. So we had a bit of time to prepare, but we also knew then that returning to study would take more of an adjustment for students. There'd been a longer gap, and there was a lot of uncertainty around what an online semester would look like. And so we developed a concept called Uni from Your Bubble. And our orientation manager, she actually delivered module-sized workshops from her home, and they were like filmed, and they were all dropped on our student portal. And the sense of community that was created as the students went through the modules together, but from their own homes, was really highly valuable in creating a common and shared connection. But what really worked was the human interaction and the human connectedness from those personal messages that were coming from Paige, and having it filmed in her home, having it about how she was responding to her own study demands, really, really tightly connected with how students were feeling. And it gave a lot of confidence that they weren't alone. And they weren't going to go through this alone, and that the university did really understand where they were at. It was incredibly well received by the student cohort, and very, very popular. And it's going to be a concept that we continue with, creating that sense of human connection through digital content. And ensuring that it's really authentic, that it's not just marketing communication or big generic posts was really important.
Yeah, I really like that idea, and I just immediately had that sense that it's felt very like personal and connected. And I think that's one thing that we know about many of our kind of current generation of students, that if it's lacking in that sense of authenticity, that it's a lot easier to turn off and kind of tune out, and making sure that it felt personal and real and kind of a shared experience, I'm sure was quite impactful.
That's right. And we'd seen a lot of our students engaging with a whole lot of poll activity, trying to generate change and responding, and student voice really, and coming through, creating kind of large community-based polling. And actually there was this wonderful poll suggesting that Paige should teach all of the programs at the university. Such was the heightened connection with her, and that confidence. So that was really wonderful to see that we could provide that for the students.
That's great. In looking at our poll results, seen a lot of Zoom, Facebook groups, Teams helping to provide this virtual hybrid and student services. Probably no surprise there, but again, we'll circulate the results of all of these. I'm going to keep us moving to the next area that I wanted to touch on one of these opportunities, domains around the kind of fostering peer connections at a distance. So if in the previous section we were thinking about how we as institutions are communicating with our students, how are we trying to help them pursue more horizontal interactions and connections amongst themselves, maybe with the university, but in a way that is promoting affinity, equity, and belonging. The aspirations that we've been tracking here for every student to be engaging in some type of sustained experiential learning, for peer relationships to serve as the cornerstone of some of their most impactful and supportive learning communities. But I think it's been interesting of one of the realities of this past year is that given how many of the usual points of interaction, of peer-to-peer interaction had been removed due to lockdown or studying from home, whether that's the athletic club, societies, kind of the post-seminar chat with friends at the coffee shop, with all of that removed, the virtual classroom actually has continued to be one of the most important venues for student-to-student interaction. And that could be informal in terms of instructors setting aside a few minutes for students to chat with each other at the beginning of class in the Zoom room or the chat feature as well, or more formally engaging in virtual debate and discussion. Interaction in the classroom has not just effective pedagogical results, but important social and interpersonal ones too. This slide comes from a presentation we at EAB did earlier in the year around creating engaging virtual instruction and encouraging academic staff for whom perhaps the shift to online was new to think about adapting and adding to their instructional approach. I think this slide also makes an important distinction too, that not every module needs to pull out all of the stops when it comes to interactivity. There are baseline practices that work well that you can turn up the dial with a major impact on student success. But we've continued to be tracking innovative approaches to a collaborative use of technology. And frankly, from our perspective, who knows whether these approaches would have come about if not for emergency remote instruction. Now, of course, the classroom isn't the only place where we've turned to virtual platforms to create connections this year. Institutions have been getting very creative in their efforts to cultivate a sense of belonging and connection. This was particularly important in the May to August timeframe here in the Northern Hemisphere, while institutions were on their summer breaks, and enrollment leaders were really worried about whether new and continuing students would show up on the first day of term in September and October. We at EAB have collected some of the most interesting and perhaps replicable tactics in the compendium, which you can access using the link at the bottom of this page. Anushka will put it into the chat area as well. We've sorted them into buckets. So thinking about building affinity and sense of belonging, hosting a mascot virtual chat and interaction, driving engagement with academic staff, the virtual library tour or an AMA with a librarian, perhaps interactions that students otherwise wouldn't be doing. Now, I sadly did not prepare a TikTok dance for you today, but those have certainly been all the rage. And I'm sure we've been subjected to a few virtual book clubs and board games this year too. So not to say you or your institution has to deploy every one of these, but if you're in charge of these experiences, particularly thinking about them across the upcoming summer holidays, probably worth thinking about whether you could replicate some of these. And we know at the very least, with globally 80% of students reporting that COVID, its lockdowns have led to feelings of loneliness and isolation, can be meaningful points of interaction as well. I want to share one other snapshot around this idea of affinity that I think you might find relevant as you reach the end of your academic year on your own campuses. As you probably know, here in the Northern Hemisphere, the academic year ended in May. So fairly quickly after the outbreak of the pandemic, many institutions had to think about what a virtual graduation ceremony might look like in the midst of a lockdown and social distancing. Brigham Young University in Utah created perhaps what we thought was one of the most effective virtual experiences for commencement ceremonies. I've written down on this slide a number of their recommendations and lesson learned. I won't walk through all of them, but they were really intentional about setting the tone that while this experience, this celebration would differ from what normally would be happening, it was still worthy of commemoration. The social media managers at Brigham Young mimic some of the most popular templates on Instagram to help students engage with each other virtually through videos, GIFs, filters, and the like. They collected short graduation speeches and messages. There were a wide swath of participants from graduates all over the world, and released special messages on the day of graduation as well, one from the president that you see here. So again, not the exact same as gathering and celebrating with all of your closest friends, but a meaningful effort nonetheless to promote affinity and connection with each other and the institution. All right, with that, I want to keep the conversation moving forward and ask Catherine to comment on how Australian Catholic University has been working to foster meaningful peer-to-peer connections at distance this year. And as before, while she comments, I'll move on to our next virtual question as well. I'm asking about virtual engagement activities that have been effective on drawing participation enthusiasm on your campuses this year. So while you all respond to that, I'll pass the virtual mic over to Catherine.
Thanks, Gary. We've done a number of events at ACU. We're a multi-campus institution, and we've really benefited from online digital activities because the students from our smaller campuses have been able to participate in a much greater way than they might have otherwise. So there's sort of three examples I'll point to. One, we've had our online open days. So for prospective students coming to learn more about the university, that's been online. And as you've just talked about, one of the things we found was the most popular sessions were the ones where students got to speak to other students. They were by far the most popular. And so we're replicating that now by offering opportunities for students to connect prospective students to connect in with current students. And then that's been picked up in terms of offering opportunities for current students to speak to each other. One of the benefits of going online is a lot of our academic staff have really improved their understanding and use of technology. And we've got a lot more of activities around students to work with each other, problem solving and working together offline. And that's been really beneficial, not just about the educational opportunity, but the actual connection, like you've just touched on as well. We've moved things like telehealth, like our counselling services and all that, and now students can book appointments online. So again, that's something that's helped our students from smaller campuses. And we too have cancelled our graduation ceremony. So we are just in the process of organising a live event that's going to be at the end of November. And it's not going to be an online graduation ceremony, but it is going to be an online event to celebrate this year's graduates who have missed out on their ceremonies. So there's been actually a lot of the things, we've learned a lot, and a lot of these things we're going to retain and keep them as an option for students, even when we do get back, when we get back to having more face-to-face activities.
Yeah, I thank you for that, Catherine, and I certainly resonate with that idea about, perhaps not surprisingly in hindsight, but students like talking with each other, and they like talking with other students, and that, providing prospect and incoming students with a point of connection with existing students is an incredibly helpful and effective method. And so, why not continue that, right? Even, in an era where the social distancing isn't completely mandatory, we still know that for some students that will be a really effective method. So I love that idea of continuing to deploy those types of tactics. I've seen some really great results of the poll coming in around virtual open days. I think I saw something around live pictures of students sharing their experiences. There was something around staff showing off staff working from home, which I like as well. So thank you for all of those comments. I'm going to move now in interest of time to the last section that I wanted to touch on. And we've mentioned this a couple times already, but I thought it merited discussing in particular an expanded mental health and basic needs mandate. In other words, in an era of unprecedented strain, how do we support our students' mental, physical, financial health? All of the available data says that students are dealing with increased levels of stress, trauma, exacerbating really an already existing and significant mental health epidemic. Of course, this can't be the responsibility of mental health professionals alone. We have to see this as a collective issue in which health and wellness is integrated into and across the entire student experience. And one of the aspirations here, making sure that mental health issues are no longer a barrier to program completion and success. In interest of time, I won't spend too much time at all on this slide, really just put together on one place some data affirming how much in general, and this year in particular, has made mental health a serious concern for all of us, right? And particularly our students as well. This is only going to become a greater challenge. And I think the concern we've been hearing is, how do we do this well, particularly in light of increasingly strained campus resources? And I think we're all right to be worrying and questioning about how we can do this at scale. Is there a way to deploy technology to help us in this as well? We've touched on this already, but institutions that are addressing the student mental health crisis effectively are doing so from a platform of coordinated care. Now, coordinated care is not a new idea in our sector. Over a decade ago, many institutions began co-locating support offices and success centers, libraries, student union buildings to make it easier for students and staff to be near each other and collaborating. What I do think is different, though, is that increasingly students and staff are expecting technology to help them do this, to give a unified record that provides a holistic look at their interactions, what that they have been doing, what they've experienced, so that students aren't having to tell their own stories over and over and over again. So again, thinking about this of creating an environment in which everyone from academic staff to student services staff, advisors, public safety officers understand their role in supporting student mental health, where resources are available perhaps at the touch of a button, or even a one-stop shop, or more accurately, a no-stop shop, because they have the 24/7 chat desk, whatever they're needed at their disposal. So all of this, I think, is important in a world in which remote learning and operations is going on, because it's even easier for students to fall through the cracks. Now, before the pandemic, many institutions had been slow to embrace tech-enabled mental health care, despite its potential to expand service, overcome logistical barriers, again, to this idea of scale. I think it's starting to change with more widespread adoption of two types of remote care delivery. The first is through traditional teletherapy. It's been popular in healthcare since the early 2000s. Usually there's a contract with some type of provider who agrees to deliver services virtually. You may have heard of Togetherall, which was formerly Big White Wall, certainly a popular service amongst educational institutions. The second way, and this is on the right of this slide, is through AI-powered mental health support. So apps, chatbots, and the like. This is becoming more popular now with more and more apps on the market, and they're all claiming to help people with anxiety, depression, mental health concerns. The apps range from simple life advice and coaching to virtual chatbots that are providing cognitive behavioral therapy, and applications that can match you with a licensed therapist. There are a number that have been particularly popular with students, these cognitive behavioral therapy trained chatbots. The idea is that they ask you a couple questions, they determine how you're feeling, what your concerns are, and then talks you through your mental state and asks you leading questions. And there's been this interesting trend that in some ways students will be even more honest because they know it's a chatbot. They don't have the stigma of confessing that they have a problem because they know it's a chatbot on the other end. Now, there hasn't been a ton of independent research on these tools, but several have been designed by researchers from Columbia, Stanford, Oxford, other places based on well-researched methods. And we've seen that even the format of these can be making a difference too, relying on gamification to reinforce results. 24/7 availability is a boon as well. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on this idea that I mentioned earlier about integrating mental health and well-being into the academic experience as well. I'll briefly describe one initiative from Georgetown University that they call the Engelhardt Project for Connecting Life and Learning. The project incorporates health and well-being issues into the classroom, which ties closely with Georgetown's own mission of caring for the whole person. The idea is that they encourage academic staff to infuse a well-being topic into current course curriculum, to find a natural way to tie that topic to content. It's intentionally left a little vague so academic staff can have flexibility in thinking about what that looks like. I have some examples on the right of this slide. So a module within anthropology on disability and culture might talk about mental health and relationships, or a module on witches in the German department might talk about social stigma and mental health. Yeah, again, intentionally flexible, but they're encouraging academic staff to say, hey, there's a way we can talk about this and embed it into our curriculum. And finally, I want to touch on one other standout issue when it comes to supporting students' needs this year: access to technology and the internet. Surely no surprise to you all that digital divide has had significant implications for how we have interacted with, provided teaching and learning experiences for our students. Certainly instruction operational issues, both now and in the future, are going to be affected by this digital divide. On the left included a few slides, or excuse me, a few stats that speak to that need. Thankfully, institutions have been rising to this challenge in creative ways, whether increasing the points of access to the internet on campus and in the community, providing emergency funds and technology directly to students who need it the most, even making sure that there are lo-fi and mobile-friendly course materials to accommodate those without the high-tech streaming access. Now, I don't think anyone would argue with me when I say that the job here for our sector is far from over, but there are promising steps underway with institutions partnering and negotiating with internet service providers, as well as local governments to expand service. Now, I know we're running up short on time, and I saw Tony joined us towards the end. I don't want to sneak attack on him, but Tony would love if you have any comments on this, or otherwise I would invite Liz and Catherine to share a little bit about how you all have been thinking about the mental health, digital divide, basic needs issues that I've raised here over the past couple of slides. Would be interested in the perspective from any of you on that front. While you do that, I have one final question here I wanted to ask about which of these specific issues you foresee as spiking as in importance on your campus next year. I give you the option to select two, but I see Liz and Catherine back on screen. Liz, I might turn it over to you to hear what's been going on in Auckland on this front.
I mean, definitely the need to support students with technology and data and devices has been absolutely critically important, and to identify those priority cohorts. But actually the thing I want to really touch on has been the need increasingly to work with other external community or government agencies to provide support for students. That some of the need goes beyond what a university can actually respond to. Some of the financial hardship, some of the well-being and welfare needs of our students, or their broader whānau, has been quite extraordinary. And we've done quite a lot of work with agencies like Red Cross and other community-based poverty groups and the like, to help ensure students, particularly as they enter the summer period of non-enrollment, are really got other supports wrapped around them beyond what the university can provide.
Brilliant, thank you. And Tony, looks like you have your video on. If you wanted to share a little bit about how this is, these issues are playing out at University of Sunshine Coast, would love to hear from you, and might also give an invitation to anyone else if you want to stay on the line for a few minutes longer. I'm happy to field questions or hear other comments. Would be happy to do that as long as we have people who are interested. But Tony, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Gary. So just in relation to all of this, I think the critical thing is to remember when it all happened. It happened for a lot of us, the pandemic and the closure of the campuses, within the first few weeks of semester. And so at that stage, there was a very different response from the students than there is now. The focus there was very much on their first assignments, whether they should leave the country, whether they should withdraw their studies and so forth. And so it was very important for institutions to get heavily involved with the communication out to the students straight away and implement a number of strategies such as emergency bursaries and so forth, and support for new grades, etc., so that they felt comfortable. What we've found throughout the semester, though, has been a significant increase in use of the mental health services. And we've actually had an increase of about 130% year on year on those services, particularly the counselling services. Most of it is anxiety, but there's been a significant increase in suicidality and so forth. And so it's really important across all of this that it's the communication with the students. So they really need to speak to people in that support mechanism. This was always challenged through the social distancing rules that we had at the time. And so the virtual environment was the critical thing that we had. But we've made sure with our rapid support services, with the counselling, that we've increased that and supported as many students as we can. And without doubt, the most important thing we did was improve our triage modelling. So we had to improve that so these students weren't waiting. So crisis presentations, we still needed a presence on campus, we found, but we were finding the most important thing was that they needed to speak to people. One of the initiatives that we implemented also was the notion of having an academic liaison officer, so an academic staff member briefed in sort of crisis management activities to assist with students directly so that they could address the academic needs. And that seemed to work really well in conjunction with the wellbeing team. So there's lots of other things, but I'll just cut it short due to time.
Yeah, thank you. Catherine, anything you would add to this conversation around mental health, well-being, addressing the variety of needs?
Yeah, Tony, I think, touched on international students. We really had to kick into gear to support our international student group in particular. And it was very practical support like food, financial support and food delivery and that kind of thing. And so we certainly, we're a mission-based university, but we certainly ended up involved in activities that went quite beyond the academic support, than similar to what Liz was mentioning as well.
Thank you. I know we're at time. I certainly understand, again, seeing that we have a few people jumping off the line, but Tony, Liz, Catherine, if you have another minute, I might ask you one other question that I think would be interesting to hear about. I think knowing what students want is always difficult in a normal year, and perhaps even more difficult when the normal modes of interaction aren't available in the same way. Curious how you've kept your pulse on student needs, perspectives this past academic year, and thinking through into next year how that might change and evolve.
I can start on that. In New Zealand this year, we've introduced a new code of practice for the pastoral care of domestic students, and a significant outcome within that code is student voice. So we're now legislatively required to understand and engage with student voice. We were able to implement a student sentiment database and reporting using Power BI, one of our technology tools, across all of our student interaction platforms, right down to our CRM system. So we could measure what students were saying through all the different channels that they would engage with us, or what services they were accessing. And through that sentiment measurement, we were able to understand, how students were feeling, whether they were feeling okay, angry, unsettled, worried, and then we were able to respond accordingly with either direct messaging, if it was sort of cohort specific, or more bulk communication in response to those sentiments.
Thank you.
I might add to that, Liz, that we certainly did a lot of outbound activities, which you're suggesting there, based on the data. But just a very fundamental thing that we did, which I think was very helpful, and most unis have it, is the students as partners. So we very much use those students as advocates to see what issues the students were addressing and how we should approach things. They were the ones that gave us a lot of advice in terms of social media approaches, the best way to communicate with students, the change of our language and so forth throughout all this, and how the timeliness of when we should engage with them. So, for example, when we started talking about the COVID through our communications, we would call it a COVID-19 bulletin. Over time, we would learn from students that they hated hearing that. They want to hear what things we're implementing rather than seeing COVID again. So we changed all of our messaging on that basis. But the continuous involvement of students through this process by having the Students as Partners program certainly assisted us.
Yeah,
that's a really interesting pivot.
Yeah.
Same with us. We've been working on a user experience project for some time, and we've been talking directly with students as part of that. And the number of students that were involved in that program has ballooned as a result. And we've we've got everything that we're thinking about changing now. We now have a process that we can just put it out there to students and get quite quick feedback in terms of what we're proposing. And that engagement's been really, really helpful.
Great. Well, Tony, Liz, Catherine, you all have been very generous with your time today, and I'm sure I've eaten into your next Zoom meeting, as it were. So I might, in the interest of time, call time on this particular session, but this has been incredibly interesting and fruitful for me. I hope for everyone who was in attendance as well. Perhaps we can even pick up some of this conversation in more detail in the future. But Paul, I'll turn it over back to you for a few concluding words from ATEM. But otherwise, thank you all very much for participating, both to our panelists and everyone else who is on the line this afternoon.
Thanks, Gary.
Gary, thank you very much.
You.
And thank you to Anushka for all her comments and her links to the resources that are available. Fantastic. Tony, Catherine, Liz, thank you very much indeed for participating as well. This is one of the free sessions we offer often with ATEM through either your membership or corporate membership, and corporate membership has just gone out to all of the members. So we encourage you to encourage your university to take out corporate membership if they haven't got it, or to renew again for the next year, because this sort of thing we really love to do. It's been enabled, as I say, by EAB sponsoring this program. So we thank them greatly. There was a bit of an issue with people getting on, so this has been recorded. So if your friends haven't been able to get on, we will send out the link to this recording once it's been modified, and we will get it to you. So we're sorry about that. We think there's an issue with the Outlook issue, but we're not sure. So, but you will get the chance to get this recording. So thanks, everybody. Thank you for participating, and we'll see you the next time we're online. Bye all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.